My name is Captain Rachel Hart, United States Army, age 32. I walked into that courtroom expecting silence and got shock instead. The judge froze, the gallery stared, and my mother's jaw fell open as my ID hit the desk. They called me the family failure, until the scanner flashed gold. What would you do if the truth you carried shattered your own bloodline? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into courtroom number 3 was the sound, that low, polished hush that only old courthouses seem to hold. Every footstep echoed like a small confession. The scent of waxed oak and paper dust filled the air, steady and cold. I'd stood in courtrooms before, but this one wasn't just a place of law. It was a stage. And my parents were already waiting for their performance to begin. My name is Captain Rachel Hart, United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, 32 years old, 10 years of service. But in this room with its marble floors and stained glass shadows, none of that seemed to matter. Here, I was once again just their daughter, the one who talked too much, acted too serious, never knew her place. My mother's gaze found me first. It flicked up from her phone like a laser sight, scanning every inch of my dress uniform. Her lips pressed together, thin and sharp. "Back row," she whispered as I approached, her voice a blade meant to cut quietly. "By the door. Try to look normal." My father didn't look at me at all. He was speaking in low tones to his lawyer, a man in a silver tie who adjusted his cufflinks as though the outcome was already guaranteed. My father simply nodded, surveying the gallery, making sure the right people saw him in the right light. His posture was still military straight, though he'd never served a day. I often wondered if he practiced it in mirrors, rehearsing authority he'd never earned. I gave them both a curt nod, my movements automatic. "Understood." The word came out clipped, almost reflexive. It was what you said to a superior. It was what I'd said 1,000 times before in court-martials, disciplinary hearings, and command briefings. But saying it to them again, after all these years, left a faint metallic taste in my mouth. I walked to the wooden bench at the back. The seat creaked as I sat, straight-backed, hands resting on my knee. From here, I could see the whole room, the flag behind the judge's bench, the quiet rows of civilians, the clock above the door. It was the kind of vantage point soldiers call good ground. Then I saw the case file on the table up front, Mitchell v. Hart. The name hit like a shell casing striking tile. My parents, the Harts, defendants in a civil suit. A landlord-tenant dispute, I'd been told over the phone. Minor inconvenience, my father had called it. A nuisance, my mother added. They hadn't summoned me for help. They had summoned me as a prop. A bailiff's voice cut through the silence. "All rise." The courtroom stood as Judge Ellen Holbrook entered, a severe woman with graying hair and the calm authority of someone who had seen too many lies dissolve under oath. She nodded once and we all sat. The clerk began to read the docket. Case number 22 CV 3417, Mitchell versus Hart. Counsel, please state your appearances. Their lawyer stood, smoothing his tie. Robert and Helen Hart, represented by... That was my moment. I rose slowly from the back bench. The sound of my low-quarter shoes echoed against the tile, 3 deliberate steps before I reached the aisle. Heads turned. I passed the front row, past my mother's startled face, past my father's sudden stillness. I reached the defense table, placed my leather briefcase beside the weary tenant sitting alone, and flipped the latch open. Click! The sound cut through the room like a verdict. I faced the bench. My voice was steady. Your Honor, Captain Rachel Hart, United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, representing the defendant, Ms. Claire Mitchell. The silence that followed felt absolute. For a breath, even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum quieter. Judge Holbrook looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. My mother's hand froze midair. My father's expression hollowed out. In a single motion, deliberate, disciplined by the book, I'd walked from the back row to the front table. not as their daughter, as counsel of record. And for the first time in my life, they had no words. I wasn't always the person who could walk into a courtroom and silence it with a sentence. That kind of composure is forged, not born. And mine was tempered in the heat of every quiet dismissal I'd ever endured. When I was 17, my mother told me I didn't fit into her world. She said it as she pinned a corsage to my younger sister's dress, the same night she told me I could reuse something from last year for prom. It was the first time I learned what invisibility felt like. Not through absence, but through presence unacknowledged. I remember standing in that hallway mirror, watching her fuss over my sister's hair, her smile wide, her voice honeyed. My reflection beside them looked foreign, someone unwanted in her own house. Back then, I thought silence was defeat. Later, I'd learn it's a weapon. I graduated top of my class. My parents didn't attend the ceremony. Traffic, they said. That was the excuse. But excuses were their currency. They always had enough to spare. I walked that stage alone, and when my name echoed through the gymnasium, I heard only my own footsteps. Still, I smiled, because I knew something they didn't. I already had a plan to leave. 6 weeks later, I shipped out to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The first thing that hits you there isn't the heat. It's the noise. Drill sergeants barking from dawn to dusk, the metallic slam of barracks doors, the rhythmic clatter of rifles being cleaned in unison. The world shrinks to simple commands. Front-leaning rest, move. Hydrate. Eyes front. It's chaos with purpose. And for someone like me, someone who'd spent her life living under arbitrary rules that shifted with mood and vanity, the clarity was intoxicating. In that place, no one cared who your parents were. The only thing that mattered was performance. Could you endure? Could you adapt? Could you learn? I did. The training stripped everything away. The need for approval, the instinct to explain myself, the ache of not being seen. In its place, it built muscle, resolve, and a new kind of silence. The calm before every test. One night, I found myself on fire watch duty at 0300. The barracks were dark, the only light a sliver of moon cutting across the polished floor. My mop squeaked quietly as I worked, the scent of pine disinfectant hanging in the air. Most recruits hated that shift. For me, it was peace. I remember leaning on the handle, listening to the slow rhythm of breathing from 50 other bunks. I felt tired, sore, but for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I belonged somewhere, even if no one said it aloud. A few days later, during weapons qualification, I earned my expert marksmanship badge. The range officer called out my score, and one of the male recruits muttered, "Beginner's luck." I didn't answer. I just reset my stance, lined up my sight picture, and did it again. Tighter grouping, same calm trigger squeeze. When the score came through, he looked over, jaw tight. I gave him a polite nod. Respect, I'd learned, isn't granted. It's drawn out inch by inch until they can't deny it anymore. My grandfather, a retired Marine Master Sergeant, used to say, "Honor is quiet until it's needed." I didn't understand it then. But standing there, brass casings cooling at my feet, I finally did. The road from private to officer wasn't glamorous. I studied on cots, read case law by flashlight, and wrote essays in field tents while rain hammered the canvas. I didn't have family money or connections, just tuition assistance, grit, and a belief that order and fairness were worth serving. By 25, I'd earned my commission. When the gold bars of a second lieutenant were pinned to my shoulders, no one from home came. I didn't send an invitation. The Army was my family now. And for the first time, I wasn't chasing approval. Years later, when I transferred to the JAG Corps, I thought back to those nights in basic training. The echo of boots on tile, the sting of sweat in my eyes, the voice that told me, "You can't." Every insult, every laugh, every whisper that said I didn't belong. They were the forge. Because in the Army, I learned something my parents never taught me. You don't need to be seen to have worth. You just need to stand your ground when the time comes to be counted. The hearing resumed after a short recess. As the bailiff's voice called the courtroom back to order, I felt the familiar shift, the quiet before precision. For me, trials weren't performances. They were operations. Every exhibit was a piece of intel, every objection, a maneuver. And like any operation, success depended on discipline. Judge Holbrook adjusted her glasses, her tone even. "Captain Hart, you may proceed." "Yes, Your Honor." I stepped forward, the faint clack of my heels punctuating the silence. On the table before me lay my exhibits, not emotional pleas, but evidence arranged with military order. I took a breath, steady and slow. The air smelled faintly of dust and varnish, a courtroom's perfume. "Exhibit A," I said, handing a folder to the bailiff. Photographic documentation of the defendant's apartment, taken March 12th by City Health Inspector David Kane. The images appeared on the projector. Walls veined with black mold, peeling paint, moisture pooling beneath warped floorboards. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. I heard my mother's sharp inhale, brief, controlled, the sound of her composure cracking. "Exhibit B," I continued. "Official Health Department report, noting multiple code violations, including failure to address hazardous living conditions. Inspector Kane verified these findings under oath." I could feel my father's eyes drilling into me, but I didn't return the gaze. Focus is armor. Distraction is vulnerability. Opposing counsel rose, his tone rehearsed. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. My clients have been proactive landlords for decades. These isolated issues hardly—" "Overruled," Judge Holbrook said without hesitation. "Proceed, Captain." I nodded once, sliding the next document forward. Exhibit C, medical records for the tenant's son, age 7, diagnosed with acute asthma. Condition worsened significantly during tenancy. I let that sink in before continuing. Records show repeated emergency visits over a 6-month period. Doctor's notes attribute aggravation of symptoms to environmental factors, specifically mold exposure. The silence grew heavier. The only sound was the soft rustle of paper as the clerk logged the exhibit. "Exhibit D," I said. "Email correspondence between the tenant and the defendants." I glanced briefly toward my parents. Documenting 6 separate complaints sent between January and March. Each message received, none acknowledged. The screen flickered through timestamps, lines of text projected like a confession. "Please, my son is coughing at night. We can't breathe in here. The wall is spreading black spots. I'm scared it's mold." Each email went unanswered. I turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, under the Nebraska Uniform Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Chapter 76, Article 14, landlords have an affirmative duty to maintain premises fit for human habitation. Neglecting known hazards constitutes breach of contract and statutory violation." The judge leaned forward slightly. "Duly noted." From the corner of my eye, I saw my father stiffen, a man unaccustomed to being on the defensive. My mother's fingers tapped a nervous rhythm against her purse. The rhythm quickened when I spoke again. "Your Honor, the plaintiff seeks not only financial restitution for medical expenses and relocation costs, but also punitive damages for reckless disregard of tenant safety." Opposing counsel shot up again, voice brittle. "Captain Hart is—" "Sit down, counselor," Judge Holbrook said firmly. "You'll have your turn." The room fell still. That's the thing about silence. Once you earn it, it becomes your ally. I advanced to my final point. "The evidence demonstrates a clear pattern, Your Honor. Not a mistake, not miscommunication. A pattern of dismissal, of indifference, of choosing appearance over accountability." For a heartbeat, no one moved. My voice, calm but unyielding, seemed to fill every corner of the courtroom. Then I stepped back, closed my folder, and said simply, "The defense rests, pending rebuttal." Judge Holbrook nodded. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." As the gavel struck, I exhaled slowly. They thought this was about a tenant and a lease. But it wasn't. This was an audit, of character, of values, of what happens when privilege forgets its duty. And for once, the record, not their reputation, would decide who they really were. The hallway outside courtroom number 3 felt colder after the recess, as if the building itself had sensed the shift in power. I stood by a window overlooking the marble atrium, my reflection framed by glass and sunlight. The trial was going exactly as I'd planned, measured, factual, irrefutable. But that kind of control always unsettled my mother. She approached first, her heels striking the tile in sharp, impatient beats. My father trailed a step behind, silent but simmering. "You really think this performance impresses anyone?" she hissed, keeping her voice low enough to avoid the onlookers milling nearby. "You're grandstanding. You're embarrassing us." I turned, meeting her gaze with calm precision. "I'm representing my client." "Your client," she echoed, her mouth curling around the word like it tasted wrong. "Rachel, she's a tenant, a nobody. You're siding with a stranger over your own family." "Correction," I said evenly. "I'm siding with the law." Her eyes flashed, a familiar mix of anger and disbelief. "You're still that stubborn little girl who has to prove she's better than everyone." Behind her, my father crossed his arms. "Your mother's right. You've made your point. Now stop. You're out of your depth here." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "No, sir," I said. "I'm exactly where I belong." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension stretched thin as wire. Then my mother tried one last jab, quieter, more personal. "You're just a grunt in a pretty jacket," she said. "Don't pretend this uniform makes you someone." I held her gaze and said nothing. Words would have cheapened the truth. Instead, I reached into my jacket and drew out my DoD identification card, setting it on the table beside me with deliberate precision. The laminate caught the light, the embossed gold eagle gleaming faintly. Beneath it sat my state bar card, proof that I wasn't just someone's daughter playing dress-up. I was counsel of record, officer, attorney. The silence that followed was absolute. They stared at the cards as though they were weapons. In a way, they were. A voice interrupted from behind. "Captain Hart," said the bailiff. "Judge Holbrook requests you in chambers briefly." "Of course." I slipped both IDs back into my pocket. "Excuse me." In chambers, Judge Holbrook stood by the window, reviewing her notes. She didn't look up right away, just spoke while flipping through the file. "Your exhibits were thorough. Clean work." "Thank you, Your Honor." Finally, she turned, studying me over the rim of her glasses. "I recall your name from Fort Riley. Corruption inquiry 2 years ago?" "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes softened with something close to respect. "That was a tough one. You handled it well." It wasn't flattery. It was acknowledgement, brief, professional, and genuine. And in a single breath, it washed away every whispered insult that had preceded it. When I returned to the corridor, my parents were waiting, their composure beginning to fray. My father's tone was low, dangerous. "You think some judge remembering your name makes you powerful? Don't forget who we are." "I haven't," I said. "I've just stopped mistaking reputation for integrity." He stepped closer, voice tight. "You'll regret crossing this family." "No," I replied quietly. "I'll regret if I stop doing what's right because of it." Their lawyer appeared then, his face pale. "We're back on in 2 minutes," he murmured. My parents turned away, retreating to their row like actors returning to their marks. As I followed, I caught my reflection again in the glass. The same uniform, the same face, but not the same woman. Years of service had taught me something civilian life never could. Rank doesn't change your worth. It just reveals who recognizes it. When the courtroom doors swung open, the whispers began again. I ignored them. The only sound that mattered was the click of my heels on tile. Steady, deliberate, unshaken. They had tried to resize me, to fit me back into the small shape they'd built in their minds. But some things, once forged, Don't bend back. When court reconvened, the light through the high windows had shifted, softer now, angled across the polished benches in stripes of muted gold. Afternoon light in a courtroom always feels heavier, as if the day itself has grown tired of hearing half-truths. Judge Holbrook took her seat. "We'll proceed to closing arguments," she said, her voice carrying with the unyielding calm of someone long accustomed to sorting arrogance from evidence. I rose first. My hands rested lightly on the table, every movement deliberate, every word measured. "Your Honor," I began, "this case is not about wealth. It is not about family standing or perception or what people in this town whisper over dinner. It's about duty, the kind owed by anyone entrusted with another person's safety." I gestured to the screen beside me where the images from earlier still lingered. Mold-darkened walls, cracked plaster, a child's inhaler lying beside a hospital bill. When we take on responsibility for others, we assume more than rent checks and paperwork. We assume an obligation. My client's landlords were notified 6 times of conditions that endangered health. 6 times they chose silence. Not because they didn't understand, but because they didn't think they had to care. I could feel the gallery's attention shift, a collective inhale. My voice stayed steady. Negligence is not just failure. It's a decision, a conscious act of ignoring what is right in front of you. No theatrics, no raised voice, just the calm weight of fact. When I finished, I gave a single nod. "Thank you, Your Honor." Opposing counsel rose next, his confidence thinned by the morning's evidence. He spoke in loops about good intentions, about miscommunication, about long-standing community members. He tried to sound composed, but each phrase stumbled against the cold reality of the record. His arguments were smoke against steel. At one point, he gestured toward me. "Captain Hart is clearly passionate," he said, forcing a smile. "But she's new to civilian matters. This isn't the battlefield." Judge Holbrook's brow lifted. "Counselor, if you're implying professionalism doesn't translate between disciplines, I'd reconsider that stance." He swallowed, muttered something about context, and sat down. The judge turned her attention to me. "Captain Hart, you mentioned the statute earlier. Do you have the citation?" "Yes, Your Honor." I quoted it from memory. Section, article, paragraph. Each number like a step in cadence. Years of service had etched that rhythm into me. Facts first, feelings later. She nodded once, closing the file before her. "I've heard enough." The room held its breath. "The defendants, Robert and Helen Hart," she said, her tone unflinching, "are hereby found liable for all damages claimed. They are ordered to compensate the tenant for medical expenses, relocation costs, and additional punitive damages totaling $75,000. A faint gasp rippled across the gallery. My mother's painted smile faltered. My father's hand clenched at his cufflink as though tightening it could hold his world together. Judge Holbrook continued. "Furthermore, the defendants are required to bring all properties they own into compliance with city health standards within 60 days. Failure to comply will result in additional fines and potential injunction." The gavel came down once. Sharp, decisive. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then papers rustled, chairs shifted, whispers rose. I didn't move. I let the moment settle. Justice isn't noise. It's the silence that follows when truth has finally spoken. I turned slightly to the woman beside me, Claire Mitchell, the tenant who had trusted me with her case. Her eyes were wet, her shoulders shaking. I reached over, steadying her hand. "You can breathe easy now," I said quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. Across the aisle, my parents sat motionless, their lawyer already gathering papers in hurried defeat. My father's eyes avoided mine. My mother's did not, but where there had once been superiority, there was only disbelief. I closed my briefcase, the latch snapping shut like a punctuation mark. No triumph, no smile, just completion. As I stood to leave, the court officer stepped aside to let me pass. The murmurs followed, low, reverent, uncertain. I didn't look back. This was never about revenge. Revenge is loud, fleeting. What I delivered was quieter, final, a verdict. By the time I stepped out of the courthouse, the day had begun to cool. The late afternoon air carried that faint mix of asphalt and rain, the kind that clings to cities after long hours of tension. Reporters waited near the steps, microphones lifted, lenses glinting. Someone called my name. I didn't stop. I wasn't there for a headline. At the curb, I paused long enough to draw a breath and center myself. The verdict had landed exactly as the evidence dictated, yet what I felt wasn't triumph. It was completion, a duty fulfilled. That's the thing they don't tell you about justice. When it's done right, it doesn't exhilarate. It steadies. In my hotel room that evening, I set my briefcase on the desk and began my next ritual, the after-action review. Every mission, every hearing, every engagement deserved one. Wins weren't an excuse to stop improving. The exhibits were still neatly labeled. A through D, sealed and time-stamped. I filed them into a folder marked Mitchell v. Hart, closed. Then, with the same discipline I'd bring to any operation, I drafted a summary report. Not for my superiors, not for show. For the record. Because professionalism doesn't end when the gavel drops. When I was done, I opened my laptop and wrote one final email to Ms. Claire Mitchell. Ma'am, attached are certified copies of the judgment and compliance order. The court will monitor repairs. Please notify me if deadlines are missed. You have my direct contact until enforcement is complete. Respectfully, Captain Rachel Hart, JAG Corps. Before sending, I added a single handwritten line at the bottom, scanned and signed in blue ink. You can breathe easy now. It was the same phrase I'd spoken to her in court. This time, it wasn't about mold or air. It was about space, about dignity. A few hours later, my phone vibrated, a text from an unknown number. Thank you. My son slept through the night for the first time in months. That was all. I read it twice, then locked the screen and set the phone face down. That message was worth more than any applause. 2 days after the verdict, a letter arrived under my hotel door. Cream envelope, my father's handwriting. I knew the tone before I opened it. The words were clipped, formal. You've humiliated us. Whatever respect this family had, you've destroyed. No admission, no apology. Just blame, dressed in fine penmanship. My mother's note came later, shorter, crueler. You were always our problem, Rachel. Now you're everyone else's. I folded both letters carefully and placed them in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't tear them, didn't burn them. Some truths aren't worth destroying. They're worth preserving as evidence, reminders of what not to become. That night, I called my younger sister, Melissa, the one who'd inherited all the approval I'd once chased. Her voice was tentative when she answered. I heard about the case, she said. Mom's upset. She's alive, I replied. That's enough. A pause. Then softly, you really did it, didn't you? I did my job, I said. That's all. But it wasn't all, and we both knew it. For the first time in years, there was no resentment in her voice, only curiosity. Maybe one day we'd have the conversation our family never could. About truth, about freedom, about how sometimes justice costs blood ties. Not tonight, but someday. After we hung up, I packed my uniform into its garment bag, folding each piece with care. The brass insignia caught the lamplight, dull from wear, yet still gleaming. A reminder that respect, once earned, never really tarnishes. Before turning in, I looked at the framed photograph I always carried. My grandfather, Master Sergeant William Hart, standing tall in his old service blues. His face was calm, the corners of his mouth drawn in that knowing half-smile. I did what you taught me, I murmured. And for the first time since the verdict, I allowed myself a small smile. Not pride. Not vindication. Just peace. The kind that comes when a soldier completes her mission and finally sets her gear down. It's strange how victory can feel quieter than defeat. When the dust settled and the courthouse lights dimmed, I realized justice doesn't roar. It whispers. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply restores balance, one truth at a time. In the weeks that followed, I stayed in Omaha longer than planned. Not for my parents, but for what still tethered me here. Old memories, old ghosts, and one final task. I visited Veterans Memorial Park on a cold Sunday morning. The granite slabs were slick with dew, the engraved names catching the light like tiny fires. I stood there in silence, tracing the etched letters of soldiers long gone. Strangers who had followed the same oath I did. To serve with honor, even when no one was watching. That's what this journey had reminded me. You don't wear integrity for an audience. You wear it because without it, the uniform means nothing. My story began in a courtroom where arrogance and control once ruled. It ended in a quiet understanding. Respect doesn't come from bloodlines or inheritance. It comes from how you act when no one else stands beside you. My parents believed power could buy silence. They learned, too late, that truth answers to no one. It doesn't bend to wealth or pride or the illusion of control. It waits, patient and unflinching, until someone finally stands up and says, "Enough." When I was a cadet, one of my instructors, a hard-nosed major who'd spent half his life in the desert, told me something I never forgot. Discipline isn't about obeying orders, Captain. It's about obeying your conscience when no one's giving them. That's the creed I followed in court. And that's the creed I'll carry long after. I used to think strength was about speaking loud enough to be heard. Now I know it's about standing still when the world tries to shove you back into silence. It's about knowing your worth even when the people who raised you never saw it. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who doubted you and stayed standing anyway, you understand. That's the quiet power of discipline. It's not flashy. It's not dramatic. But it's unbreakable. I still keep one thing from that day. A folded copy of the court order, sealed and stamped. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every verdict tells two stories. One about law, and one about legacy. That paper may have carried my parents' names, but it carried my grandfather's lesson too. That honor, when tested, must always choose truth over comfort. In the end, I didn't win because I was smarter, or stronger, or louder. I won because I stayed steady. Because when everything turned personal, I refused to make it petty. That's what soldiering teaches you. Not how to fight, but when to hold your ground. And that's what I'd tell anyone listening now. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Respect doesn't come from fear. And justice, real justice, never needs revenge. It only needs courage. So I'll ask you this. Have you ever seen someone underestimated until they proved everyone wrong? If you have, tell me in the comments below. Like this video if you believe respect should be earned through integrity, not intimidation. And make sure to subscribe. We share new stories of honor and hidden strength every single day. Because sometimes, the best revenge is simply doing what's right. And walking away in silence.